So today we are going to be talking about providing spiritually sensitive care for people who manage a serious mental illness. Just to give you a background on how I came to this, when I was in my master's level programming, I worked at a day treatment program for people who managed both an addiction and a serious mental illness. When I went undergraduate training, I cut my teeth as a therapist in a maximum security psychiatric prison. I went on to intern at a state hospital and do my first couple of years of practice getting my license at another state psychiatric hospital. So the beginning of my career was really all serious mental illness. And these issues did come up very frequently, and what I observed is that a lot of people really misunderstood what the needs were when individuals with serious mental illness have spiritual concerns that are relevant to their treatment. There is an intersection of identities that unfairly stigmatize people who manage serious mental illness, especially when there are spiritual concerns involved. So we have an ethical obligation to provide recovery-oriented, client-centered care for everybody, but especially including those who have serious mental illness. Those who manage serious mental illness face a great deal of discrimination. They face discrimination in access to housing, they face discrimination in access to jobs. But one of the things that most disturbs me is that there is substantial evidence that individuals with serious mental illness face discrimination from healthcare providers. They are less likely to be referred for procedures. Often their healthcare providers presume that they will no-show. They are less likely to be given basic screening and preventive care. And as a result, these individuals live 20 years less than their peers who do not have serious mental illness. The CDC has taken apart this research and found that it is actually the actions of healthcare providers essentially denying care that accounts for most of this difference in how long folks with serious mental illness live. Mental health providers are unfortunately not immune. Very often mental health providers do not provide the same resources or the same level of recovery-oriented care to people who are managing a serious mental illness. Then we add to the serious mental illness the individual's spiritual or religious identification, and often that contributes to more misunderstanding. Mental health providers often have less training than they need in understanding spiritual issues. We have an obligation to provide spiritually sensitive care, and it is sadly not unusual for us to miss the mark when we are trying to provide spiritually sensitive care to somebody who is managing a serious mental illness as well. One of the places where we do tend to get lost is when somebody has religious or spiritually involved delusions. So when I was in school, I'm old, it was a long time ago, but when I was in school, I was told religious and spiritual delusions never respond to treatment. They're a bad prognostic sign. Those people are not going to get better. My professors were doing their best and were reporting what they understood, but they were wrong. More recent literature has demonstrated that spiritual and religious delusions don't respond to treatment when you don't provide any treatment for it, when you don't talk about it, when you just pretend it's not there. And that's actually why it usually doesn't respond to care, because mental health providers kind of go deer in the headlights with it and don't deal with those delusions at all. So we need to take a different approach. Research on people who are managing serious mental illness tell us that Most of them want their spirituality considered in their care. We need to adhere to our ethical obligation to provide spiritually sensitive care. And other research shows us that most find that their spirituality facilitates their recovery and their capacity to manage their serious mental illness. So again, we are doing our clients a very substantial disservice if we don't open up that. If that's something that they want to look at, we need to open that up and look at it with them. So for the rest of today, I am going to share a series of case studies, and I'd like us to talk about them together to figure out what we would like to do if we were the therapist working with this individual. We'll spend a lot of time discussing and problem solving together and generating some ideas of where we might want to go. So Trisha's a 27-year-old Latina. She has 2 children. She had a very substantial problem with postpartum depression after the birth of her first child, who is now 2. She just had a second child, and now she is coming to a psychiatric prison hospital because she tried to drown her newborn. And when we sit down with her and say, "What's going on? Why were you trying to drown the baby?" She explained that she has been having a large number of visions, and God has been telling her very out loud that the end times are coming, that everybody is going to be subjected to, there's a Christian belief, there's a bunch, Christianity is a very big and wide place, but there are Christian sects who believe that before the end of the earth, there is going to be a tremendous wave of wars, diseases, terribly torturous events that are going to make it very hard for everybody who lives on the earth at that time. Trisha did not want this to happen to her baby and thought the baby's only way out was to go ahead and die before all of this happens. So that's where you are. As a therapist, you are sitting with Trisha. You have the opportunity now to ask a lot of questions and do a lot of assessment before you take next steps. What do you want to know? What do you want to assess? Take off, do open the microphones.
I can chime in a little bit on this one. Sure. So we know in postpartum psychosis, would want to know the history, particularly if there's any prior psychotic episodes, or bipolar illness. So I'd want to ask questions about those, get a history prior to this.
Okay, so in Trisha's case, she had a very serious depressive episode for her last postpartum event. It did not appear to be bipolar. It did not appear to be psychotic, but she was severely suicidal. So much so that her community's pastor, who usually is not open to people taking psychiatric medications, actually intervened with the family and said, yeah, Trisha needs to go to the hospital and she needs to take the medication that they give her. So it was a really serious depressive episode. What other things do you want to know about Trisha and her family and her background?
Did she express how she was introduced to the material, the source material that gave her those delusions about end times?
Oh, what an excellent question. Yes, she gave us a very detailed account of that. She told us that she was at her stove cooking up a pot of spaghetti for her family, and she felt something, it felt like something almost hit her, like there was an electric shock to her brain. And at that time, she started hearing God's voice telling her that the end times are upon us, that she needs to make sure everybody around her knows about that people need to to repent, and that she needs to protect her family. And the voice now speaks to her several times a day, every day. She also has been so involved with this voice and trying to make sure that she does what it tells her to do, that she has not been sleeping. She has been busy making posters and flyers to tell everybody that the end times are upon us and getting those out to her community. Really good question.
A follow-up, is that an audible voice of God or an internal knowing?
She hears this voice as though it is coming from outside of her head. In fact, she locates it very specifically at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Other things that you'd like to know about Tricia?
I'm curious if she's ever had a similar experience where if God has ever spoken with her before, and then if there are any other instances of her hearing people speak with her that aren't there.
Good question. She says that up until the point where she had that sort of electric impact in her head, that has never happened to her before, which is actually surprises me a little, because one of the questions that I'm surprised hasn't come up is, what faith is she exactly? She's an independent evangelical Pentecostal faith, so the idea of hearing voices in her faith is not an unusual thing. But it is not an experience that she had before. On the other hand, given her faith beliefs, hearing the voice of God is not that abnormal, and it is usually considered a good thing, like a level of spiritual awakening. Are there things that you would like to understand about Tricia's family, about where she grew up? Yes, Libby.
When we're talking about her community of faith, you had mentioned that the pastor tends to discourage taking psychotropic medications, but in a previous case had encouraged it for her. I'm curious what role and what sphere of influence the religious community, and especially the religious leaders, might have in her determining what kind of treatment she will engage with.
That's a really good question, and one of the things that is striking to me at this point where she is being admitted to a prison hospital is I am not hearing from the family that anybody has contacted her clergy, and her clergy was really involved in her care during her last episode. So what do you think? Is there anybody besides me in the room who's like, can you sign a release so that we can please speak with your family and your clergy? And,
and if there's been a rift between, say, family and clergy, or herself and her
right.
community of faith.
Right, we definitely need to know where that is. So previous episode of Care, family was very involved. Spouse was with her on admission at this time as well, and that was our primary source of information about the historical episode and about the involvement of clergy in her previous episode of Care. Are there other psychometric assessments that you would like to give for Tricia?
Well, I'm just spitballing here, but from your explanation of how her family and clergy all of a sudden seems to have abandoned her, that might be what pushed her over the edge to think it was her obeying God and it was up to her now on her own, and this is the best she could do with what she knew up to that point in time.
Right? So stress might be a factor in, this looks like some sort of postpartum episode. She may be definitely needing some contact with her clergy and with her congregation. And at the same time, what she has attempted has been, like, she's in there with charges of attempted murder. There may be concerns that her community has about not wanting to be associated with that. So that might be something that would be dealt with. I would be, if that were the case, like if the clergy has been involved in somebody's care in the past and they're not now, and I can't get a release to do that, I would definitely be reaching out to my hospital chaplain. That is definitely one of the resources that we'd want to get to. I'm also really wanting an MMPI. I would like to get some personality testing, and when I worked with, obviously these cases have been de-identified, etc. But when I worked with a similar case in the past, the MMPI not only showed psychosis, but also showed some mania, which actually didn't surprise me because she hadn't been sleeping. Was refusing meds, was trying to be cooperative with people in every other way, but was refusing medications. How would you pursue counseling with Tricia? So both the MMPI and the presentation kind of look like you're looking at a postpartum bipolar disorder with psychotic symptoms. The individual is a very religious individual, and she frames the disorder in spiritual terms. If this were your client, how would you go about talking about this with her?
I might suggest like a psychodrama where she would disassociate herself from herself so she could view herself so that she could be just a passive viewer of herself,
Mm-hmm.
and then discuss what's going on, what her seer sees in the other person that she is projected outside of herself.
Yeah. So externalizing is a technique that we call that in psychotherapy. And yeah, for her to look at, gosh, if you were somebody else and you observed a mother trying to drown her newborn, what would that look like to you? Does that look like something that God would want to you? Correct. From the outside? Those can be useful questions. So the way I wound up working with her, and she would only see me if the chaplain was with me, by the way. So chaplain and I worked together. And here's how we did it. You've told us that you felt that there was an electrical shock to your brain. That actually makes a lot of sense. Your brain is an electrical organ. It passes messages across different nerves in your brain using electricity. It sounds like some sort of spiritual force attacked your brain and created some kind of electrical impact that has injured your brain. And then I handed it to the chaplain to try to figure out, now, is this spiritual force a good spiritual force? Has this come to you from God? Or is this spiritual force something that's yielding something bad? Is this spiritual force a problem? In working with the chaplain, she was able to see, yeah, you know what? I'm not able to do anything in service to God from here in prison. I'm not able to parent my children. I'm not able to meet my family responsibilities yeah, the force that hurt my brain may have been disguising itself as God. And in her faith, it happens that Satan just sometimes can try to disguise herself as God. That made sense to her. Once she had that understanding of how the disorder started, she was on board with using medicines to try to heal the damage that was done to her brain. We got her clergy on board. He was again like, yes, you need to use medicines. They're not for everybody, but for you, you need to use medicines. So once she was willing to use medicines and completely cooperate with care, she was eventually able to be released with close monitoring and able to join her family. There was quite a bit of legal work that she still had to do, but eventually we had a good outcome. Had we not addressed her spiritual concerns in that, what do you think the odds were that we would have gotten her cooperation with care and wound up having a good outcome? The take-home lesson is don't ignore the spiritual concerns here. So let's take a look at case study number 2. So this individual is in an outpatient intensive addiction treatment program for people who are managing both addiction and a major mental illness. So Donald is 35 years old. He is in really good recovery from both schizophrenia and an addiction to cocaine. As he was dealing with both of those illnesses, he spent some time incarcerated, and in the course of his incarceration became familiar with Nation of Islam and felt that Nation of Islam was critical in his recovery. In particular, the Nation of Islam belief that substances are not okay and do a disservice to your ability to be in service of Allah. That's what helped him to stop using, and his ability to stop using and stay clean and sober made a huge difference in his ability to manage the schizophrenia, stay on his medications, manage his sleep, be careful about his decisions. Donald is coming to us realizing, now that he's stable, when he was really ill and in the throes of the addiction, he wasn't thinking at all about sexuality. Now that he's got kind of a stable life and he's working and things are going okay, he's come to realize that he is gay. And he is really struggling because there are the faith beliefs that, as far as he's concerned, saved his life. And then there is a feeling of love that is sacred for another man in his life. And he is not able to reconcile these two. So Donald's in an ethical dilemma. So are we, because we have an ethical obligation to provide GLBT affirming care, and we have an ethical obligation to respect the faith that Donald identifies with when he comes in the door. What are your thoughts? What might you do with this? This, by the way, so I did my dissertation in GLBT issues, and for much of my career, I have been the place in the facility where GLBT folks are preferentially referred. So this is an ethical dilemma that I've run into a whole lot of times. What do you do with this?
I might try a form of very gentle education, not to challenge any of his beliefs, but speak in the area of, well, when the Quran was written in such and such a year, this was the beliefs. And since then, we have learned that there is a continuum with gay on one end and heterosexual on the other end, and we're all fall somewhere within that continuum.
So there's stuff about that that's a really good idea, and there's stuff about that that we need to refer to somebody else. So it is within our scope of practice at mental health providers to talk about there is definitely a continuum between what we think of as fully, I don't like the word heterosexual, I prefer the word non-gay. But, you know, people's types of attraction do vary between completely opposite sex, completely same sex, and that's within the scope of our practice. As mental health providers, we cannot even begin to interpret scripture. So we're not allowed to say diddly squat about the Quran, or we're practicing outside our license. And this is why you will hear me say this a lot. We get on the phone to the chaplain and I say, okay, look, this is what I am working with. Chaplains can come up with all kinds of resources. They can come up with research literature around. Right now in the Muslim community, there is an interesting debate going on around GLBT issues, and there are people on both sides of those issues. And the chaplain could get me all kinds of information about where the broader Muslim community is and about where my local communities are. So that, you know, there are local Muslim communities that are not at all accepting of GLBT identities, and then there are local communities that actually are. But I'm really glad you brought that up, Terrence, because it's a really useful look for us is where's the edge of our scope of practice?
This may be why Jared Pinsky referred me to this session, because I have a PhD in religious studies, a PhD in philosophy of religion, and a PhD in biblical studies. And I'm an ordained minister and certified spiritual counselor. I am not a psychologist, although I've taken so much for my own personal enrichment.
Right.
I know how to be helpful. And my last 20, 30 years it's been like an avocation.
Okay.
So and I'm a little bit like Archie Bunker when it comes to using words from my day to today's day. I'm sensitive, but I'm not all that schooled on it. So gotcha. I apologize for not using the term non-gay.
That's okay. And that's not the last word definitive way of doing it. It's my preference, because when I am working with my GLBT clients, if I use the term non-gay rather than heterosexual, then that makes me the exception, and their way, sort of the normal language, gay is who they are. Non-gay is the exception. So it's an affirming way of doing it.
I see that nuance.
I really don't like the colloquialism straight, because that makes it sound like somebody who doesn't have opposite gender attraction is crooked, or they're in some way deviant, defective, different. That's why I prefer non-gay, but that's not necessarily industry standard, and there may be people more updated in this area of practice than I am, and I welcome other voices to the conversation about that.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention that my first thought here was not only consulting with chaplaincy but also asking about the supports that he knows of or online, communities, forums that maybe he could engage in. Maybe his community isn't that large. Maybe he's in a rural area. I'm not sure. And so it could be difficult to maybe find that kind of dialogue that he may want to have with someone who's more knowledgeable. So that could be potentially helpful to find those online communities that may discuss with him more in depth. And he has that level of potential anonymity that comes with that in case he's not comfortable with talking about other people in his faith community about this yet,
Right.
I don't know if he's come out to them or has kind of started that process, but he could want to kind of keep that closed until he himself has a better understanding of where he lies.
Right. That is an excellent point. The online faith communities are a new post-COVID era resource. Another option that we have here in the VA is we always have a GLBT coordinator. And so that person is likely to be well networked in the community. And if there are GLBT affirming Muslim resources in the community, if the chaplain doesn't have those, the GLBT coordinator may have those. So thank you. This has been a helpful discussion. So the outcome with this particular case is, with the help of the chaplain, Donald was able to explore some local community resources, and he was able to, one of the things that he made really clear to us was that he wanted an Afrocentric faith. That was what drew him to Nation of Islam. That was what he was finding affirming, that healed a bunch of the impact of racism on his life. He was able to find, it wasn't a big community, but he was able to find a small GLBT affirming Muslim community. And he had a home again, and he was able to make peace with who he was. So, last case that I will bring up today. Robert, this is a fully outpatient case. He is in treatment for borderline personality disorder. We're using dialectical behavior therapy, and part of a dialectical behavior therapy program is learning about mindfulness meditation. Robert has come to this. He's really excited about this. His mental health has caused him a lot of challenges for a long time. He would like this to get better. People who are managing borderline PD are in a great deal of pain a lot of the time. But he was extremely concerned when we started DBT and we started talking about mindfulness meditation. He's like, wait. I'm pagan. I worship the Norse gods. I am really concerned that practicing something that comes from Buddhism is going to be a violation of my faith beliefs. I don't want to drop this line of treatment, and I don't want to violate my faith integrity, and I'm not sure what to do about this. So, what else do you want to know about what's going on for Robert? Who do you want to talk about? What do you want to assess?
Well, the first thing I would say, if I was speaking to the gentleman, is I would affirm his sincere spiritual beliefs that he acknowledged and compliment him for that. And if he wants to get help, he has to expand his parameters, at least to look. You don't have to buy into it, but look of, I would have to study on those Norse gods and see if there was something inside of that faith that would allow.
Right. And that's what I was thinking. So there's a bunch of ways we could do that. One is, in the hospital setting, in the VA, we can always say, hey, chaplain, help, because they're the folks with the degrees in comparative religion. They know how to get accurate information on that. One of the questions I asked him is, tell me about how you worship. Do you have clergy? Can I ask your clergy about this? And he said, well, yes, I am a member of a coven. The coven actually covers a bunch of different kinds of pagan belief, and there's a group of us in this coven that are Norse god worshippers. And I do have clergy, and I would love it if you would please talk with her. I am happy to sign a release to have you talk with her.
I have worked with Wiccans and atheists and done well, slowly. But I had positive results, and I think he would be in a different but similar category to be reachable.
So let's think about involving clergy with an individual who has borderline personality disorder. In the context of a religious congregation, do you think the symptoms of borderline personality disorder would become apparent? I'm seeing people nod. In fact, might those symptoms become disruptive to the functioning of a faith community? They in fact do. And so when I reached out to the coven leader, she was, first of all, already very aware that Robert was in care. She was the one who had referred him to care. Said, let's have a discussion between the three of us, and let's talk about this. So we met, the three of us together, and Robert was like, I want to be true to my worship of Thor, and I am not familiar with a meditation practice that is traditionally practiced in the worship of Thor. And she said, when we start worship every day, every time we get together for worship, what do we do first? And he says, oh, we sit down and we center ourselves and we take deep breaths. Where do you think she went next? This is a meditation practice. It is, in fact, a mindfulness meditation practice. If you pursue this mindfulness meditation practice with your treatment, it will not only be consistent with your faith, but it will deepen your ability to practice this faith and to do so with the integrity that is so important to you. So if nothing else, like there's no case that we had today that we didn't reach out to either chaplain or clergy, and that became the turning point, was our ability to work across disciplines and to be aware of, here's how far my scope of practice goes. Here's where chaplain and clergy's scope of practice starts. So Terrence, I'm really glad that you were here today because you represent the other side of that scope of practice. Other thoughts about Robert? Has anybody dealt with similar clients? Have thoughts about this? So I apologize, I skipped this slide. But one of the things that the coven leader was very supportive of, as you can imagine, and I think you would find this in any kind of congregation, coven leader really wanted Robert to get better in his therapy. The way they expressed it in the coven was the rule of 3. Whatever energy you send out into the world comes back at you threefold. When Robert would become angry and upset with others in his coven, the way she described it to him is, you're sending out energy that you don't want coming back at you. The more you learn how to have some serenity with your emotions, and how to work with other people and resolve problems with other people, not only will things work better for you in the coven, but the energy that winds up coming to you is going to be much more positive. So, to sum up what we've learned today, we have an ethical requirement for spiritually sensitive care. Most individuals who are managing a serious mental illness want their spirituality considered. It is not ethical for us to go, oh, I don't know what to do with that, so I'm going to pretend I don't see it and I don't hear it. That's not okay. It's also okay for us to say, gosh, I don't know much about that faith. I need to talk with a chaplain. I need to talk with your clergy. For most people who are managing serious mental illnesses, their spirituality is a resource for recovery. And if we don't open the door and give them permission to talk about it, or we just go deer in the headlights when they do talk about it, we are not being helpful, and that is less than ethical practice. And finally, be aware of what your scope of practice is. We are the experts in relationships. We can talk about relationships with a higher power. We can talk about relationships with a faith community. We can talk about relationships with clergy. We can talk about the impact that depression, PTSD, psychosis has on the way we think about our higher power and our practice of faith. If we are going to talk about the faith specifically, like what's written in the Quran, what's written in the scripture, that is not ours. It is not ours to do practices such as prayer in session. If the client wants that, that's the time to be referring to chaplains or clergy. So that is the PowerPoint. These are the references. If you would like the references, I'm happy to get you a copy of this PowerPoint so you can take a look at it. And I will take this off the screen so that if people would like to ask questions or initiate any kind of discussion, that we have some room to do that. Thoughts, reactions? Was anybody surprised by things that they heard today?
I was impressed by the creativity employed and collaboration. That's probably what struck me the most.
Right now, it feels really creative in mental health to be working in the area of spiritually integrated care because none of us are taught that. I would wager that, like, hopefully 10 years from now, people won't be thinking of that as creative. You know, I can think of another case that I dealt with. Somebody who was hospitalized who firmly believed that a practitioner of dark magic from their culture, this was a Central American person, they believed that a practitioner of dark magic had placed a curse on them. Medicines weren't working, counseling wasn't working. The client's concept of the problem was this was dark magic. Again, we got hold of the chaplain. The chaplain was able to find a shaman from that culture who was able to conduct a ceremony to reverse the curse. Symptoms disappeared immediately. Now, if we are open to looking at our client's explanation of their symptoms, that's not creative. If, on the other hand, we pigeonhole ourselves into cognitive therapy and the way that the psychologist thinks about the disorder, that's very creative and out of the box. So I think between the fact that there is a renewed emphasis on recovery-oriented care and the fact that there is an explosion of research in spiritually integrated care and how we address spirituality in care, hopefully if I do this presentation 5-10 years from now, nobody's going to use the word creative to talk about what was done. Yes, Terrence.
I have a footnote I would like to interject.
Yeah.
I have seen a need and maybe filled it with my own initiative between, there are, like you said, definite boundaries between spirituality and clinical psychology, and there is a divide, a line, a border, a boundary. And since I have done so much decades of studying philosophies of religion, and I developed my own 88 module help guide that I have titled Behavior Modification Through Spirituality and Values Clarification. And all it is the decades of different courses I've studied and successfully completed. I cherry picked them, this, that, and put it together in a hodgepodge. And I wrote the people that I cherry picked their little golden nuggets from, and I asked, is this fair use or is this plagiarism? And one of them wrote back, not only is it fair use, it's good use. You have our permission, so I have it in writing that I can do that. And it's a non-denominational, open-ended questions or statements to prompt thinking responses, and I've done well with it.
Awesome. This is a direction that we do see expanding in mental health, both from the chaplaincy clergy side and from the mental health provider side. There are an increasing number of uses, like secularized uses of meditation approaches are becoming extremely popular. In my own work, there's a VA developed self-forgiveness workbook that uses cognitive therapy strategies to help people walk step by step through self-forgiveness. There is a growing body of research and published work in this area, and I'm really glad that you are contributing to it. Okay, we are approaching the 10 of the hour mark, so I want to check before winding up. Obviously, those of you who are here can always email me if you have further questions or point of discussion. Anything else we want to bring up before we wind up? Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate your participation in the discussion, and we'll be in touch later.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I've been a lone wolf, and now I feel a little inclusion here that I have been looking for.
Awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. Let's stay in touch.
Yes, well, next Monday we do it again.
Okay, great.
So long, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.